All right, we are recording. All right, I'll start this list over again. Kincaid, Andrea, gotcha. Mullins, no. Lewis, Lewis is here. Cooper's here. Hunter's here. Caleb Melton is here. Chafe, Chafe. Okay. Crowder's here. Reinhardt. Isabel Melton's here. Minter. Julia. Rogers. Rogers is here. Kaylee or Callie, last name Talbert. Callan.
Here.
Where? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to learn names and faces. Hannah. Larissa is here. Madeline is here. Hughes is here. Galloway. Gotcha. Galloway is here. Cook is here. Durgan is here. Samuel. Tate Spade is here. Who is? Jones, thanks. Burton, Kinder. Well, Burton's here. Kinder is online. Jones, wait, you just told me. Jones will be late. Canterbury. Price. Anybody I haven't called? That's promising. Morning. Last name? What's your last name? Thank you. Julia is here. Anyway, we've still got, what, a little bit less than a minute. So some reminders. If you're in Section 1, we have lab today. If you're in Section 2, we have lab Wednesday. I sent emails, mass emails. So there's a group email sent out to Section 1 and a group email sent out to Section 2. So if you don't know what section you're in, just check your emails and you should know. Otherwise, just come to my office for office hours and I can help you figure it out. If you're scheduled to make it today, but for some reason can't, just come on Wednesday. And as you probably know from the emails, if you read them, I am looking for a few volunteers for some people to permanently switch from Mondays to Wednesdays, but we'll cover that when we get to lab. Another good reminder, you should watch, if you weren't in the lectures for the first two lectures, you should watch those videos. There's a few people who, at least according to this, have not done that yet. On that note, there's a lot of emails that I still need to catch up on because I mostly took the weekend off. So if you turn anything in over the weekend, including attendance stuff, there's a chance I haven't seen it yet. Last name?
Hobson.
Hobson?
Yes, sir.
All right. Huh. How about last name? I mean first name, sorry.
Zach.
Zach?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't have you in on here. That's okay. Can you stay after when we're done really quickly or briefly? Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Anybody else that I didn't call? All right. It's 8. We will slowly get started. Like I said, we're already recording. So does anybody have any questions about what we've covered so far or the class in general or lab? Any of that? Nice and easy. All right. So for attendance, once again, if you're online, you're just going to send in some words. There's only one of you online as far as I know. But anyway, you'll send in the words at the end, sometime before 9 a.m. And, of course, you guys are invited to send the words to if you want for extra credit. But let's see. So the first word for attendance will be a thing right there. I'm not even going to say it because there's a few different ways you could write that down, and I want to see what you guys say for that. So, but that's your first attendance word, is that thing right there. I'm thinking like there's 2 different words, 3 different words you could use to describe it. Well, it's probably a lot more, but anyway, that's your first word. So if you're online, send that in for attendance. And if you're here, you can send that for extra credit sometime before 9 a.m. But if I remember correctly, this is where we left off, right? Does anybody remember? Am I wrong on this? Okay. So anyway, we talked about the levels of organization and how we can start really small and learn about molecules and atoms, which basically makes everything up, and then move your way up, right? Molecules and atoms make up, atoms make up molecules. Molecules make up organelles. Organelles make up tissues, so on and so forth. But this basically is like the map of what we're going to learn in this class, sort of. We're going to start small. So once we're done with chapter 1, we're going to talk about chemistry, which is what molecules and atoms are. Then we're going to talk about cells, which is going to be organelles and a little bit of tissues. And we're going to talk a lot about cells and the different things cells do. Then we're going to kind of move up until finally we end up with talking about the whole Earth, right? The entire biosphere. Anyway, so any questions about that? So again, I'll remind you, for the exam, it's a multiple choice exam. So yes, you do need to know all these things in order. But there's not going to be a question where I say, write all these things down in order, right? So there'll be a question maybe where I have them all listed, and maybe one of them is going to be out of order, and I'm going to ask you to pick that thing that's out of order. Or I might say, the scientist is studying organelles. What is the level of organization above that, right? And then you have multiple choice, and tissues, which is the correct answer, will be one of those choices. Any questions about this slide? All right. Biology. So again, we're going back to biology, right? What are we talking about? What is biology? We learned last week that biology is the scientific study of life, and we talked about what life was, right? So now we're coming back to this idea, this definition of biology. It's very broad in scope. Not that you need to know that. I'm not going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you that. Biology has a very tremendous diversity of life. Not that I'm going to ask you that, but again, chapter 1 is very much like a preview of what this entire semester is going to encompass. We will be talking about the diversity of life later in the semester. We talk about the source. We talk about the fact that the source of this diversity is evolution. Again, I'm going to put an X through this, indicating that will not be on the first exam. This is just a preview of what's coming up. And again, like I said, this is a preview of what's coming up. So anyway, I'm going to slide past this unless anybody has any questions. Because again, this is not important. I'm just teaching out of the textbook. Here's something you will need to know later in the semester. So again, backing up, when we talk about the diversity of life, later in the semester, you will need to know this, right? You'll need to know how we start. Like the largest classification is domain, right? So we are eukaryotes, including all these other things. And again, I'm going through this quickly because this is just a preview. We'll go into greater detail later in the semester. Anyway, within the domains, you have kingdoms. For example, us, we are in the animal kingdom. Within that, you have phylum. For example, we are vertebrates, right? From that, you have class, then orders, then family, then genus, and species. So again, I'm going to put a big old X through this. Not because you don't need to know this, but because you don't need to know this yet. This is going to be on a later exam. But again, it's a 100 level class. I teach out of the textbook, and your textbook did bring this up in the first chapter. So again, when you're studying, do not study this picture. This is just an example. This is just a preview. Any questions so far? All right. Let's talk about the branches of biology. Let me put a big old question mark next to this. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask any questions about this, but let's talk about it anyway. This is definitely a good idea for independent work. There's a lot of independent work topics in this. Biology is broad. It contains many branches and subdisciplines. Here are just some examples from your textbook. Molecular biology, and there's going to be a whole section of that. So again, this course is just biology in general, right? It's a big over-branching term, but that is some of the stuff we're going to cover. We're going to cover molecular biology. We are going to cover a little bit of microbiology. So we're talking about things like bacteria. We will bring them up later. Neurobiology, right? So anything to do with the brain. We won't be discussing that, but you can look up that stuff up if it's interesting to you for independent work. Paleontology, so things like dinosaurs, right? Again, something we won't cover in this class, but if you're interested in it, you can look that up for independent work. Zoology, right? So the study of animals. We will discuss some animals, but zoology, generally speaking, will not be covered in this course. Same with botany. That's the study of plants. But we'll talk about plants, at least how they work. We'll talk about how plant cells work, but other than that, we won't be discussing plants. But again, if you're interested in it, that is a good independent work topic. Biotechnology, that's a big one in this campus. That's what our master's program is for. So people who are getting their master's degree here are getting it for biotechnology, which is basically like applied molecular biology, but we'll cover that later in the semester. Ecology, that happens to be one of my favorites. We're going to cover that later in the semester too. Anyway, that's it. So that's the list from your book. Let me put it next to this, indicating that you don't need to memorize that list, but it's there if you want. And again, if any of that stuff interests you, then you can look into it for independent work. Any questions about this slide? All right. Let's talk about scientific ethics. Scientists must ensure that their efforts don't cause undue damage to humans, animals, and the environment. Actually, let me put a next question mark to this too. This is really important as far as what scientists should and should not do. But I'm putting a question mark next to it because I'm not sure how important it's going to be for the exam. I'm not sure I'm going to include any questions about this or not. Scientists must ensure that their research and communications are free of bias. That's a really big one. We're going to talk probably today, if not today, then the next time we meet, about biases. We're talking about peer-reviewed. Who here knows what peer-reviewed journals are? Have you heard that term? Okay. So yeah, that's part of peer review, right? We're going to talk a lot about that bullet point. So that brings us to bioethics. Again, I'm going to put a question mark next to this because I'm not quite sure that I'm going to ask you any questions about this. But bioethics are important. They're evolving. Things change, obviously, as technology changes. As you can imagine, science changes. Therefore, our ethics change. Right? Right now, we have the ability, I would think, to genetically modify. Oh, yeah, I do know that. Yeah, we have the ability to genetically modify a human, right? So we could take a zygote, right? A zygote is one single cell, and change it, edit it. But that's a new thing, right? So that's a new thing for bioethics because obviously there's a lot of ethical concerns with that, which is a good independent work topic. So that's what I mean by evolving, right? So as things change, as technology changes, then you have to readjust your bioethics. Because again, using that one example, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have that conversation about should we or should we not edit a human embryo because we didn't have that technology, but we do now. Bioethics defines the guidelines, which makes sense, right? So the guidelines of how these scientists should and should not act. And usually these bioethics come after unethical practices. This is a big thing in the Marines too, where they used to say every rule is written in blood. And it's the same with bioethics very often. Usually somebody did something wrong, and then someone says, oh, wait, we shouldn't do that. We should have a rule against that. And again, you can see your textbook for more examples. But again, I want to point out there's question marks for those two things because I'm not quite sure I'm going to ask you any questions about this. And I'm probably not. The next word for attendance, I'm going to circle it. There we go. So if you're online, just send that word. If you guys are here live in person, you don't have to send these words, but again, you can do it before 9 a.m. for extra credit. Any questions about this slide before we move forward? All right, so you'll notice I'm going pretty quickly through this because a lot of this is, I don't want to say unimportant, but chapter 1 is very much a preview of what the whole semester is going to be. So that's why I'm going through this quickly because even though we're brushing past it, we will get into greater detail later in the semester. Here we go. This is back to the chapter overview. Again, this chapter is broken down into 2 main parts: themes and concepts of biology and the process of science. So we've already talked about themes and concepts of biology. Let's talk about the process of science. Because again, as you need to know, actually, let's see if anybody can remember. What is the definition of biology, at least the one that I want you guys to know, the one that I'm going to ask you in the exam. Yes, sir. Good. The scientific study of life. Despite what you probably heard, the study of life, I like the scientific study of life. It's a little bit more specific. So earlier, last week when we talked about that definition. So it's like, all right, if biology is the scientific study of life, what is life, right? And that's what we talked about up there at 1.1. So now let's talk about what is science. And this, to me, is probably the most important for you guys. So none of you are biology majors, right? Just double checking that. All right. You're not biology majors. Actually, are any of you any kind of science majors? Chemistry, computer science, anything like that? One, what do you? Computer science? Okay. Which is interesting. That's very applied science, right? And we'll talk about that difference a little bit later too. But we are talking about not applied science. And again, we'll cover that as we move forward. But this probably is more important for you guys because none of you are going to be, well, at least you're not planning on it, right? None of you are planning to be scientists, except one person who's a computer science major. But you all deal with science in your everyday life. So that's why this is a little bit more important. It's not as specific as biology, it's just science in general. So here's the learning objectives for this section. You need to be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences. You need to be able to understand the process of scientific inquiry. You should be able to compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning. And finally, you should be able to describe the goals of basic science and applied science, which is what I was going at earlier, right? So what we are learning is basic science. Probably what you're learning is applied science. Computer science is very usually practical and applied. And again, we'll get to that shortly. Any questions about the learning objectives? All right, let's talk about what science does. Science gathers knowledge about the natural world. Another way to describe it, that your book doesn't do it this way, is that it is the inquiry-based effort to describe and explain nature. So that's what I want you to know. So if you're taking notes, or even if you're not a note taker, you might want to note that because this is different than your textbook again. And I like to make it very clear when I deviate from the textbook. So that is the definition of science that I want you to know for the exam. Science is the inquiry-based effort to describe and explain nature. In other words, right, that's how we ask questions and answer those questions. That's what science is. It's all about asking questions and answering them in a methodic way. Your book also talks about the fact that science is a social thing. It's a social enterprise because discoveries are made by a community of researchers, right? No scientist works alone. If you were to read pretty much any peer-reviewed journal for biology, it's going to start off in the introduction of the abstract where this scientist whose research you're reading, they are quoting other scientists almost always in their introduction. We'll put it next to that, though, because I'm not going to ask you that on the exam. The methods include observation, record keeping, logical and mathematic reasoning, experimentation, and then finally submitting conclusions to the scrutiny of others. Again, peer review, which we'll talk about later. And I'm also going to put it next to this because as far as the exam is concerned, that's not an important bullet point. Again, this is all just an introduction mostly to what this entire semester is going to be. So yes, we're about to talk about all of these a little bit deeper. But are there any questions before I move forward, before we start talking about these a little bit deeper? Okay. Science is a Latin word meaning, well, it comes from the Latin word meaning knowledge. I'm also not going to ask you that, so I'm going to put it next to that. But again, I teach out of the textbook. Your textbook brought that up, so did I. And your textbook defines it as the knowledge about the natural world. So again, I already told you the definition I want you to know about science, and I'll back up and show you one more time. Right? It's the inquiry-based effort to describe and explain nature. But your textbook defines it as the knowledge about the natural world, which is also accurate. It requires observations that can be confirmed and measured. That's important. I'm not going to put it next to that. You do need to know that. That might make its way into a question somehow. Science requires observations that can be confirmed and measured, which actually puts a lot of limits on science, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit throughout the semester, but science is different than religion, for example. Those things are not mutually exclusive, but they aren't in the same realm. Science cannot prove or disprove the existence of God. because we can't confirm or measure that, right? So there's a lot of things outside the realm of science, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with studying those things. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that science has those limitations. But yes, that's a very important limitation, right? These observations have to be confirmed and measured. They're also subjected to repeated testing, which is also really important. Because it's not like, we kind of do like an easy version of this in this course, right? So we have lab once a week. When you go in and you do an experiment, you do the experiment once, you collect your data, and you draw some conclusions. But in the real life, it wouldn't work that way. In the real life, if you did an experiment, then you would keep doing it, keep doing it, and keep doing it. You would need more data, and then you would find ways to tweak your experiment and make it a little bit different. We'll talk about that later too. But yeah, it's subject to repeated testing. But generally speaking, when you read something that somebody has discovered in science, it's usually not the situation where they did one experiment and got their data and like, oh, eureka, I figured it out. Usually, it's not like that. Usually they do more testing. Again, like I was saying earlier, science cannot be applied to purely moral questions. So we mentioned earlier that, for example, there are bioethics, right? So there are some rules that people have applied to science, and there should be those rules. But specifically speaking about science, technically, there are no built-in rules, if that makes any sense. Science itself doesn't say, all right, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. Going back to the example I used earlier, we have the ability to edit a human embryo, but we don't, right? Morally, people are objected to it, so we don't. So there are morals that dictate how we do science, but science in and of itself does not answer moral questions. So how many of you have had my Bio 108 class? I know at least one of you have. Anybody else? So this is good, right? Think about module 1 when we talked about the ethical points of view, right? Consequence-based ethics, virtue ethics, all those questions. We can't apply science to that, right? Using, again, that as an example, using coal as an example. Should we or should we not use coal to produce electricity? That's a moral question. As you learned in that course, I can give you the pros of using coal and the cons of using coal. Scientifically, I can give you the data, but it's up to you to make that moral decision of what you support and what you don't support. And that will be very important throughout the semester. Not academically, not for exams, but it's just this idea of, I'm going to tell you, this is the way this is, here's the facts, and then you use your own morals to decide what you support and what you don't support. Also, science cannot be applied to aesthetic questions, like which guitarist is better, Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix, right? That's not a science question. It's an aesthetic question. Cannot be applied to spiritual questions, like I mentioned earlier, right? Because we can't confirm that. We can't measure it. So that is one of the important and big limitations to science. Any questions about this slide before we move forward? Yes, good.
So you said that it can't answer spiritual questions, or you can't ask spiritual.
I guess it wouldn't hurt to ask. The problem is I don't think you can answer it. That's a great question. Because, and this is the big thing right here, you need to be able to confirm and measure stuff in science. You know what I mean? So unless you could somehow confirm and measure anything spiritual, then it's just out of the realm of science. That's a great question. And later in this chapter, throughout the semester, we'll talk about testing hypotheses and theories, things like that. And one of the things we'll talk about too is how you can't prove a negative. For example, science cannot prove that Bigfoot does not exist. Now, if Bigfoot did exist, science could prove that, but science, Bigfoot does not exist. But science cannot prove that because you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that they don't exist. And I would take questions on that, but we'll come back to that idea. Anyway, that was a great question. Any other questions before we move forward? Nope. All right. Here's a big one, the scientific method. You definitely need to know the scientific method. So if you're paying attention a little bit, pay attention a lot right now. This is something you definitely need to know. Before I jump into this, there's a few things I want to say about the scientific method. First of all, it's not set in stone. So I'm going to give you this scientific method. And as far as the exam is concerned, it is set in stone because I'm going to ask you to know these things in these order. But in real life, it's not actually set in stone, right? This is a loose guideline. Science does not always follow this directly. Sometimes you start at a different step. Sometimes you work backwards. But for the purposes of the exam, you do need to know what I'm about to teach you the way I'm teaching it. Also, one more thing before I jump into this too is just like the characteristics of life. If you were to look this up on the internet, you'll probably find a different answer. Even if you were to look at the old textbook I used to use, it would find a slightly different answer. So again, for the purposes of this exam, you need to understand the scientific method as I'm about to teach it. But just so you know, keep it in the back of your mind that this is just how your textbook teaches it. There are slightly different ways to teach it, and it's not set in stone. That being said, actually, before we even get into the steps, let's talk about some nomenclature that you need to know. First thing you need to know is what a hypothesis is. This is very important. And if you've had my 108 class, you know this is important, and you know I'll make corrections a lot. A lot of times people confuse hypothesis with something else, and we'll get there. I'll talk about that when we get there. But what is a hypothesis? You need to know this. It is a suggested explanation for an event or a tentative answer to a question. It can be tested and falsified, and it is not necessarily an educated guess. I added that part because usually, I think people still teach that in K through 12. What is a hypothesis? And they'll say it's an educated guess. That's not necessarily true. So if you know that bullet point, brain dump it. There's nowhere, actually, that will be an option on the exam. That will be the wrong answer. So when you're taking the exam, and then it's asking you what a hypothesis is, and one of the choices is an educated guess, don't choose that one. That is not the answer. Because it could be an educated guess, but that's too vague. So if someone said, what caused this cold spell that we just went through last week? Right, it's supposed to warm up today, but what caused that? That would be a question that could be answered by science. A hypothesis, I could make an educated guess and say, well, probably what caused that is God's angry at us. So he just wanted to chill us out a little bit. That was an educated guess I just made, but that's not a valid hypothesis because I cannot test or falsify that. That might be true. Maybe God is angry at us. Maybe God caused it on purpose. But scientifically, that's invalid because we can't test it. We can't falsify it, right? How would we test that? Yes, this is a very important bullet point. Make sure you know what a hypothesis is. And again, going back to the Bigfoot idea, if I were to say as a hypothesis, Bigfoot does not exist. That's not a valid scientific hypothesis. I can't prove that. I can show you that there's no evidence that says Bigfoot does exist, but that in itself is not sufficient. I cannot test and falsify that. And again, using the same example, a valid scientific hypothesis, not a correct hypothesis, but valid, would be Bigfoot does exist. That can be tested. That can be falsified, so to speak, right? So I can show that there is no evidence, right? There's no evidence that Bigfoot exists. Anyway, any questions about what a hypothesis is? Very important. We will be covering that throughout the semester. That brings us to the next word that you need to know, scientific theory, which is not a hypothesis. It is a generally accepted scientific theory is thoroughly tested and confirmed explanation for a set of observations or phenomena. A better way to think about it for the exam and just for the course too is to compare a scientific theory to a hypothesis. And you'll see this later in writing. But basically what you need to know about a theory as compared to a hypothesis is it's broader in scope, like it's bigger, right? A theory is bigger than a hypothesis. And it's been confirmed. And again, we'll talk about this distinction a little bit later. So right now we're just scratching the surface. So that brings us to a scientific law. Scientific laws are often expressed in mathematical formulas and describes how nature will behave under specific conditions. For example, gravity, right? We have gravity laws, right? We can express that mathematically. We know if I drop something, it'll accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared, right? Those are scientific laws. Anyway, what we're going to be dealing with mostly in this course is this one right here, hypotheses. We'll bring up theories every once in a while. We'll bring up laws every once in a while, but hypotheses is really what we're dealing with in this class. which are questions or answers to questions that we can test. Any questions so far? All right, let's talk a little bit more about a theory. Like I said on that last slide, we're going to talk more about it. So here we go. A theory is a comprehensive, well-substantiated explanation that is broader in scope than a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is very narrow, right? So again, I could say what caused that cold weather in West Virginia last week. That would be, and then I could provide a hypothesis for that question, right? That's a very specific answer to a very specific question. A theory is much broader, right? So, and for a theory, we might talk about climate, not just the one specific weather phenomenon. Anyway, yeah, for the exam, note this bullet point. A theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis, and it's well substantiated. That's why I hate it when I hear people say, oh, it's just a theory. Well, a theory is a big deal. A hypothesis is just a hypothesis. A theory, in scientific terms, means it's pretty much accepted. So when someone says in everyday language, well, I have a theory, usually what they mean is I have a hypothesis. A theory is only widely accepted if it's supported by a large, varied, growing body of evidence. So again, for example, the theory of evolution, which we'll talk about later in the semester, it has a very large, varied, growing body of evidence. Theories are used to explain many observations and devise new and testable hypotheses. And again, I'm going to come back to that bullet point a little bit later. But again, understand that these two bullet points kind of go together. Because theories are broader than hypotheses, right? You have this one big theory, and from that one big theory, you can come up with all these different smaller hypotheses. And again, we'll talk about that later today, hopefully. Like any scientific idea, theories must be refined or abandoned if new contradictory evidence is discovered, right? So we still have the theory of evolution because there is no new contradictory evidence. Same thing with global warming, climate change. As much as people might hate it, that's the theory because there is no new contradictory evidence. Anyway, any questions so far? Let's see. The next word for attendance will be, here, I'm going to write it. So again, if you're online right now, just send these words sometime before 9 a.m. If you're watching the video, send those words. Actually, send a picture of that word if you can read it. Sorry about all those lines. And of course, the rest of you can send in those words for extra credit if you want. Yep. Email all those words at the end, sometime before 9 a.m. All right. Let's again dive into this difference between hypotheses and theories. So here's an example of two different hypotheses that are unrelated to each other, or at least they seem like it, right? One hypothesis is long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. Right? So here's a picture I took of some tree. You can't see. What we have here is basically a rock or concrete there, and then a lighthouse. So there's no soil, but that tree still found a way to live. That's the observation. And from that, I could come up with that hypothesis. Like, oh, well, how did that happen? And the hypothesis could be long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. Someone else might have some completely different study that they're looking at, and they might have a hypothesis that the unusual bone structure in hummingbirds' wings is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers, right? But there are two different hypotheses that seem to have nothing to do with each other. One of them is talking about plants, one of them is talking about animals, but they're very specific, right? So then we take a step back and talk about a theory, right? So in contrast, the following theory ties together these two seemingly unrelated hypotheses. And that theory is this: adaptations to the local environment evolved by natural selection. So that is the theory of natural selection. I'm going to put in a big X to this because this is just an example. I'm not going to specifically ask you about natural selection yet. That'll be later in the semester. And for this first exam, I'm not going to ask you to memorize these details because this is just examples. But yes, that's how it works, right? So we have this one theory, and from this one theory, we can come up with all these different hypotheses, which is a great independent work topic. Speaking of which, you yourself can do this. You could choose another theory if you want. Based on the theory of evolution, you can just come up with questions. anything you can think of. If you like music, you think to yourself, is there an evolutionary reason that humans like music? Come up with a hypothesis and then look it up and write about it. Or if you like sports, is there an evolutionary reason that some people like sports better than others? Or that some people excel at sports better than others, right? Is there an evolutionary reason for that? That's the theory. You can use that theory to come up with that hypothesis and then look it up for independent work. Anyway, any questions about this? The relationship between a theory and a hypothesis? All right. Here's another word you need to know, a fact. We definitely deal with facts in science. A fact is a piece of information that is considered objectively true based on all current evidence. So if I were to say, Mexicali, that place called Los Agaves. If I were to say Los Agaves is 3 miles away from here, I'm pretty sure that's true. Let's assume it is. That could be a fact, right? That is a piece of information that is considered objectively true. It is 3 miles from here. Now, if I were to say Los Agaves has the best margaritas in town, that is not a fact. I agree with that, maybe. But that's not considered objectively true, right? That's subjective, right? The best margarita. Who's to say that, right? So that's subjective. A fact is not subjective. A fact is objective. A fact can be verified. Therefore, it is distinct from opinions. Again, I can verify the fact that Los Agaves is 3 miles away. I can look on Google Maps. I can ask Siri. I could drive it. We can verify that. A lot of people associate facts with science. This is important. Not for the exam or for any testing purposes, but just keep this in mind. Accumulating facts is not the primary goal of science. So, for example, for my thesis work, I was looking at the different genes involved with trichomes. So it's like, have you ever heard of, probably not, I don't know. There's like little hairs on plants, so they're called trichomes. So I was trying to find out which genes were responsible for that growth on those plants. So I collected a lot of facts, right? I did a lot of research, had a lot of facts, but those facts in themselves, by themselves, are meaningless, right? I had to apply those facts, make them useful. So again, gathering facts is not the primary goal of science, right? It's taking those facts and making them make sense, which is what this next bullet point is all about, right? The cornerstones of science are the explanations that apply to the greatest variety of phenomena. So for the exam, I would say these 2 bullet points are your important ones right here. This one and this one. This is all important before the exam. If I ask anything, that's what you need to know, right? It's objectively true, based on all current evidence. It can be verified. It's different than an opinion. And if you've had my 108 class, even though I didn't really harp on this in the 108 class, that's also the theme of that class. In a sense, in one sense. For example, we talk about coal mining. I'll use that example again, right? I can give you the facts and say, here's the facts of how coal mining is bad. Here's the facts of how coal mining is good. Those are all facts. And then it's up to you to have your opinion on what you support and what you don't support. Anyway, any questions about what a fact is? All right. You definitely don't need to know this. And if I remember correctly, this is from your old textbook, but it's good to point out. Newton, Darwin, and Einstein stand out in the history of science because their theories had broad explanatory powers. So it wasn't because they gathered a bunch of facts. It's because the facts that they gathered explained things, big things. And really, the only one that's important for us in this course is going to be Darwin, but we'll discuss him later. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about the natural sciences. That's science related to the physical world and its phenomena. So basically, that's what we're doing, right? Biology is one of the natural sciences. As far as the exam is concerned, this is not a very important slide, so I'm going to put it next to this. Again, this is just an introduction to the entire semester. But yeah, when we think about natural sciences, you can think of a natural science museum. And the stuff you might see in a natural science museum, well, that's natural science. Biology, astronomy, physics, chemistry, math, geology, etc. Natural sciences. I'm not going to ask you this, but again, your textbook talked about it. I teach out of the textbook, so here we are. You could look this up for independent work. Ooh, actually, this brings up a good point. One of you, I don't remember who, but one of you wrote a paper that was about science. Actually, the whole paper wasn't. Anyway, somebody had something in their paper that was not about biology. It was about science, but not biology. And I told them, as I'll tell you now, it's a good time to let you know. If you write a paper about science in general, as opposed to biology, right? Maybe you write about geology or chemistry or whatever. If you write about that, will be worth half credit. Better than nothing, right? This is a biology class. I want you to focus on biology. But if you want to, you can still write about other sciences. Again, you'll just get half credit. Any questions about this slide or independent work? All right. So again, I'm going to put another X to this as an indication. And I'm not going to test you on this. There's no complete agreement when it comes to defining what the natural sciences include. So yes, I just gave you a list on that previous slide, but it's not like there's some Congress, some worldwide Congress where people make decisions like this is a science, this is a natural science, this is not a natural science. Right? Nobody's making these decisions. It's all arbitrary. Some divide natural sciences into life sciences and physical sciences. We'll put it next to this too, not because it's not important, but because I'm not going to test you. Again, this chapter, I really don't even like this chapter. It's an introduction to the entire semester. But anyway, life sciences are sciences that study living things, obviously, right? Like biology and its subdisciplines. Physical science studies non-living matter, right? So that includes astronomy, physics, chemistry, geology, sort of. Actually, I'm curious if anybody wants to look that up for independent work, because I don't know the answer. Based on this, would you consider, okay. Geology is probably a physical science, but you could probably argue that it's a life science too. So geology is all about rocks, right? But they also look at rock layers and the fossils in those rock layers, and the fossils are life sciences. So anyway, you can look that up if you want for independent work. But again, I'm not going to test you on this. It's just an introduction. Are there any questions about this slide? All right. There are two methods of logical thinking. You need to know the difference between them for the exam. You need to know the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. If you find it confusing, don't let it stress you out, because if anything, there might be like one question about it on the exam. But yes, there probably will be the one question. So let's talk about it. What is inductive reasoning? It uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion. It involves formulating generalizations inferred from careful observations and the analysis of a large amount of data. And it goes from specific to general. So, right, you're getting a bunch of specific examples in inductive reasoning, and you're making a general conclusion. So, I don't know. Can someone name an artist that you don't like? Like a musician or something. Anybody? No one wants it. Taylor Swift? You're not a Swiftie? Why you got to be so mean? But yes, all right. So using that as an example, if you don't like Taylor Swift, right? So you listen to this song, you don't like it. You listen to this song from Taylor Swift, you don't like it. You listen to this song from Taylor Swift, you don't like it. So therefore, and then I present you, hey, Taylor Swift, she's got a new song. You want to hear it? You probably say no. You've not heard it before. You don't know that it sucks. But you can use inductive reasoning, and I know this is objective or subjective, but you can use inductive reasoning. So, well, I know I've heard this specific song, didn't like it. Heard this specific song, I didn't like it. Heard this specific song, I didn't like it. So I know in general, I'm probably not going to like it, right? That's inductive reasoning. Does that make sense? All right. Deductive reasoning is basically the opposite. Deductive reasoning is used in hypothesis-based science, and you'll see why. We're going to kind of come back to that theme a little bit later. Like I said earlier, it's the opposite of objective reasoning, and it uses general principles or laws to predict specific results. So I don't want to use the same example for that because there are no laws that dictate the quality of Taylor Swift's music, which she writes all of her own music, by the way. Anyway, so deductive reasoning is the opposite, right? We go from general to specific. A good example of that is we know about the theory of evolution, right? So because of that theory of evolution, which is very general, I can make very specific predictions, very specific hypotheses. And again, we'll come back to this theme throughout the semester. So long story short, for the exam, you need to know how these two are related and not for the exam, but for your own knowledge, just know that we are going to focus mostly on deductive reasoning throughout this entire semester. Any questions about this slide? Moving right along. I can't wait to be done with this chapter. I don't like this chapter. The two main pathways of scientific study are descriptive and hypothesis-based science. You need to know the difference between those two. Again, it'll probably be on the exam, but if it is, probably just one question. So it's one of those things that if you're studying it and it's stressing you out, don't worry about it. Just one question. So descriptive or discovery science aims to observe, explore, and discover. Meanwhile, hypothesis-based science begins with a specific question or problem and a potential answer or solution that can be tested. But basically, descriptive or discovery science is usually broader in scope than hypothesis-based science. And if you want, this would be a great topic to write for independent work. Come up with some examples. Write a paper, even if it's a short paper. Maybe just provide one example of somebody who does discovery science and one who does or has done hypothesis-based science. And I'll give you one example, and now you won't be able to use it for independent work. But have you guys heard of the lady Jane Goodall? She was old when I was young, and I'm old now, so I can understand if you don't know who she is. Anyway, she was the lady who worked with chimpanzees, right? She lived with them, she observed them, she took years and years of data. But that was descriptive science. That was discovery science. She wasn't trying to answer any hypotheses. Like she wasn't like, all right, I wonder what a chimpanzee would do in this situation, right? She wasn't testing any hypotheses. She was just observing them and taking data, right? That would be discovery science. Hypothesis-based science, again, it's answering questions. So once again, you do need to know the difference between those two for the exam. And for your own knowledge, this is the bullet point. This is what we will be doing throughout the semester, hypothesis-based science, mostly. Now, to me, descriptive discovery science is more fun. I prefer to I'd rather just go out in nature. If someone says, all right, go out to Canal State Forest and tell me how many oak trees you find. Sounds probably pretty boring to other people, but I would love to do that. Just go out and count all the oak trees. That would be descriptive or discovery science. Anyway, any questions about those two? All right. Oh, yeah, one last bullet point. As your book points out, the boundary between the two often overlap, right? So again, using Jane Goodall as the example, as she's observing these chimpanzees in her discovery science, right? She's observing them, and then she might come up with a hypothesis, right? She might see some sort of behavior and think, why in the world do the male chimpanzees always do this on the full moon, or whatever it may be, right? So then she has that question, and then she might be able to test that question, right? And that's where you would have the overlap between hypothesis-based science and descriptive science. Any questions about this slide? All right, here we go. This is really important for the exam and for the semester. It's a very, very important slide. You need to know the scientific method. Again, like I mentioned earlier, and I should have mentioned it now instead of then. Now's the time to bring this back up. When you look this up in a different source, it might look different, right? So this is the scientific method as your book teaches it, therefore as I teach it, therefore how I'm going to test you. But keep in mind, like it says here, it's a general guideline. So it doesn't always follow these steps. And again, if you look at it somewhere else, they might describe it differently. Here we go. The first step that you need to know for the exam is observation, right? You observe something. That is the first step in science. So using my own thesis as an example, we observed, you can look at this watermelon plant, look at this watermelon plant, but hey, that one's a little bit hairier than this one, right? I've observed that. This plant is hairier than that plant. This plant doesn't have any hairs at all, right? So I'm observing all these differences in the watermelon plants, which then leads you to a question. In this case, that question would be, what causes this? Why is this plant hairier than that plant? Why doesn't this plant have any hairs at all? Or again, trichomes is the technical term, but yeah, that was the question that was being asked. Or more specifically, which genes are, in this case, which genes are responsible for those hairs? And that leads us to a hypothesis, right? As you already know, we've already talked about them. Hypotheses are tentative answers. You need to know that. That's very important. So in that case, for the question, what genes are responsible. The hypothesis could be, I think this gene is responsible, this gene is responsible, and this gene is not responsible, right? Actually, this is a great example too. Because in my thesis, I really didn't have a hypothesis the way that I teach, the way that you're learning a hypothesis. I didn't really have a hypothesis. I had the question, which genes are responsible? But in this case, and again, this is a great example of how this is just a general guideline and how sometimes we deviate. I deviated. It's not like I had some hypothesis that this specific gene was responsible and this one wasn't. I didn't really have a hypothesis. I had the question, and to answer the question, I just gathered a bunch of data, and I looked and I said, all right, these really hairy plants had a lot of these genes. These really bald plants didn't have those genes. Therefore, those genes are probably involved. But I didn't have a specific hypothesis. So again, this is just a general guideline. Anyway, after the hypothesis comes the prediction. I'm going to pause on this because this will be important for your lab because these two always come together and people often mix them up. Hypothesis and prediction. You need to understand the relationship between the two. So again, a hypothesis is like a tentative answer that you can test. But a prediction, that kind of describes how you're going to test it. It's usually an if-then statement. For this course, it's always an if-then statement. A prediction is an if-then statement. It describes how you will test your hypothesis. Hold on, let me see if I have this on the next slide. No. All right, so let me talk about this very quickly. As you know from, well, no, you haven't had it. If you do the extra credit lab, or if you've already had my 108 class, you've done the first lab, and there's a good example of this relationship between the hypothesis and the theory. So when you have a hypothesis in the real life, in the real world, not in our labs, but in the real world, when you have a hypothesis, you test it many different ways. I'm trying to think of the example I used in that lab. So, and I might be remembering this correctly, or I might not. I don't even have a dog. But the hypothetical hypothesis there, or the observation is, the spot in the yard where my dog pees has very nice grass. That's the observation. Which leads to the question, is dog urine good for grass? Which leads to the hypothesis. Well, there's only two basic hypotheses to that question, right? If the question is dog urine good for grass? What are the two basic hypotheses? It's either this one or that one. Can anybody tell me? I'm asking you the question, is dog urine good for grass? Someone provide me with the only two hypotheses that are possible. Perfect. Yes, it is good for grass, or no, it is not, right? Those are the two basic hypotheses. Now, don't get me wrong. You could get really specific and say, well, dog urine, 50% dog urine and 50% water is best for grass. You could get specific, but generally speaking, those are the two hypotheses, right? It is good for grass or it's not. That's your hypothesis. Let's stick with, I don't know, dog urine is good for grass. That's the hypothesis. From that, you can make different predictions to test your hypothesis. So you could say, if my dog stops peeing where it usually pees and pees somewhere else, then that grass will no longer be as good, right? That's one way of testing it. If I make the dog pee somewhere else, and then that might support my hypothesis, but then I'll test it again. And then I'll say, if my dog starts peeing here instead of there, then the grass is going to be good right there, right? That's another way of testing my hypothesis. If I were to go visit all my friends who own pets and see where their dogs pee, then the grass in that spot is going to look good. Does that make sense? All these different predictions to test the hypothesis. It's very important for this semester. You need to understand the difference between the two. And that's it. Wow, 8:50. So the last word for attendance will be dog urine. I guess that's two words, but anyway, dog urine is the last term for attendance, and I will see you guys at 10 a.m. in H205, or I'll see you on Wednesday. And if you came in late, make sure you email me and tell me you came in late, because I don't have you down for attendance.
About 5 minutes late. What was the first attendance word?
Oh, you can't get it.
Oh, okay.
That's part of it. But
Do I came in late and just email the rest of the words?
yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah. And once I put out the recording, you can look up the word if you want. It's up to you.